Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the CQII Newsroom. I am Jane Caruso, and we have a very special report for you today. Today, we are going to focus on focus groups. And to help us guide that discussion, I have a nationally recognized quality improvement specialist with us today. His name is Adam Thompson, and I am going to let him introduce himself. Adam, could you give us the Adam Thompson elevator speech?
Yes, good morning, and thank you for having me, Jane. I'm really excited to be here. Myself, along with, I heard 1 billion other people, we're spending our weekend with Game of Thrones last night. So in honor of Game of Thrones, I thought I would introduce myself in Game of Thrones style. After spending the weekend with Daenerys Targaryen, I thought putting out fires in a system was bad, but I gotta tell you, you haven't seen anything until you've had a bunch of dragons hanging around your house. So she made some recommendations that one should have fireworks and a scepter. So I'm here to introduce myself, as my name is Adam Thompson of the houses Appalachian and Deming, first of his name, bringer of suppression, queen since his ascent from the closet, disruptor of systems, and grandson of quality.
Adam, thank you so much for that. And I hope that in a week, you'll come back on the show and give us a little foresight as to who will be sitting on that Iron Throne at the end of the Great War.
Absolutely, and I think we're all hopeful that it'll be longer than 54 minutes next week's episode.
Okay, now that we all know each other, let's get started. We'll start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. Julie Andrews told me that once herself. So, what exactly, Adam, is a focus group, and why should I consider doing one?
Good question. So a focus group is really just a method of gathering information that's particular to the experience of the persons that you serve or you provide care to. And what's different about a focus group than some other methods is that it really allows for an interaction amongst the members. A focus group can create the space for a community of people to respond, which allows for a dialogue that can produce a really rich discussion rather than simply capturing a single person's experience during something like a key informant interview. A focus group also allows for an organization to determine what is exceptional versus what might be typical. Sometimes we think that a single person's experience is indicative of the entire patient or client population, when in reality it could be their experience. So when you have a group of people in the room, it allows them to sort of respond to one another to either validate that person's response and say, yes, this is my experience as well, or to dissent from that and say, you know, that's really not been my experience, to make sure that the information you're getting is useful across the entire segment that you're working with. A focus group is also a really great way to make sure that your clinical quality management efforts are aligned with your community priorities. What pains a system for you might not always be what's meaningful to the patient. So a focus group allows that dialogue where you can uncover things that might be really important to your community that maybe your CQM efforts should be targeted at.
Great. Okay, so my goal is to acquire meaningful experiences and information. How do I determine what the best questions are to ask so I get the information I need?
Identifying the why of your focus group is a really critical part of the planning phase. An organization is bringing people together for a purpose, such as getting feedback on a pain point or a potential quality improvement project. Like surveys, you should really think about crafting your questions in advance of the focus group so that the organization or the institution can ensure that the questions are actually going to hit the target. Also, by crafting your questions in advance, you can really make sure that the facilitator is prepared to know exactly what information is going to be needed and what the scope of the focus group will be. A danger could be that your questions are too broad. And when you get too broad, you might get interesting information, but it may not actually be informative or specific to the goal of the focus group. You might also want to test your questions with a small group, maybe 1 or 2 persons that are a patient or a client, or it could be conducted with potentially a member of your clinical quality management team, such as the person living with HIV that you've embedded in the team, or you could think about using your consumer liaison at the regional group level. You also want to be really careful about the number of questions you ask. You could end up in a place where the balance gets off. You want to strike that balance so that you have enough questions to get the information you need, but not so many questions that you don't actually have enough time to have people answer them. Too many people, and you risk moving too quickly through those answers, and you might miss meaningful responses. Or worse, you make your participants feel like their time wasn't valued. What you're really looking for in a focus group is a discussion. So when you think about your questions, you should consider that probably each question will need about 10 to 15 minutes to answer, especially once you've probed at some of the responses, and you want to make sure that you've ensured that everyone's had a time to answer what you've asked. It's really important to also think about building in time for people to reflect on the questions. You might be very familiar with the questions that you're asking, but your participants probably aren't. So you want to ensure that you have enough time to, one, get through the questions, while two, also ensuring that the participants have time to reflect on the question and respond.
Okay, Adam, so I think I'm understanding the question piece, but I have to ask these questions to people. So how do I know who the right people are to bring to the table, and how many of them do you think I should have?
Great. Let's start with who are the right people. So one might think that anyone is a good focus group member, but it's important to think about the people you're inviting and ensure there's a good mix of both experience and personality. A support group seems like a tempting body of people to dip into. And while having some support group members is a good idea, you want to ensure that the focus group is reflective of your entire clinic or organization community. Not everyone has the same experience. And selecting only out of a support group means that you've predetermined some of the characteristics of your participants by only bringing those people who feel comfortable in a support group environment. You want to consider thinking about a couple things. One, long-term survivors, long-term patients, newly diagnosed, people who are new to your clinic, gender and sexual minorities, racial and ethnic balances, age groups, geographic locations, level of patient activation. I mean, only the organization knows who the mix of their clinic community is. So you want to ensure that the people in the room are reflective of that larger community. The topic of your focus group may also affect who you want to recruit. For example, if you're looking for ideas on how to improve cervical cancer screening, you might want to consider first who in your clinic needs a cervical cancer screening, and what mix of experiences do you want to bring to the table, while also considering comfort in the discussion. For example, a transgender man may not feel as comfortable sharing his experiences and needs in that care with a cisgender woman in the room as well. So you may end up thinking, you know, I might want to have two focus groups so that you can make sure that everyone in the room feels safe, they feel affirmed, and they feel they can contribute to the conversation in a meaningful way. Determining the number of people can also be really critical to ensuring your success. Too few people, and you may end up listening to the sound of your own voice. Too many people, and you may end up disengaging participants who don't feel like their time was valued because they didn't get to respond to some of the questions. Generally, more than 5, but no more than 10 is a good balance to have a rich discussion and enough time to answer the question.
Okay, Adam, so I'm going to gather my 5 to 10 people, and I would think we would want to inform them of their commitment to this project. So are focus groups generally a one and done? Are they done in series? I think that's probably important information for them to have before they sign on.
Yeah, how you structure your feedback is really dependent on what you're trying to do and the approach you want to take. You can certainly have a single focus group around a very specific topic, which may only take one session. And if you're trying to discuss something that's particularly sensitive to people, you may actually consider a key informant interview as a better option. Or you may want to establish a regular feedback loop where you can build a small community of respondents who regularly check in over time about something. A quality improvement project is realistically done in steps. Having a focus group might actually mean a small advisory board to your project, which you bring information to over the course of the project. In that case, you would want to ensure that participants understand that what you're looking for is their participation over time. Another innovative approach to breaking sort of the focus group mold is to potentially bring people together over time to get feedback in a different way. Imagine you could bring a group together first to identify the areas where they think their care could be improved. Then you and your coworkers could go back to the office, aggregate those outcomes into a smaller list, where you bring the focus group back together to, one, check in and make sure that what you heard and digested was in the way the information was intended, and two, to gather feedback on how to specifically improve a few areas that were identified. Once you've identified potential change ideas from your clinical quality management committee, you might actually bring those ideas back to the group so that they can help you prioritize. And while this is starting to sound a little bit like an advisory board, keeping the focus group framework allows you to communicate the limited nature of the involvement and keep it focused on recommendations rather than the establishment of an advisory board, which often has a different connotation for communities in role and scope of the work.
That's great advice, Adam. And while I'm jotting some of that down, can you talk to us about engagement? How do I get folks to want to participate? Do I pay them? Do I incentivize them? What's the story on that?
So the frame I like to put on this is to consider your focus group as specialized consultants. Would you pay a consultant to come and provide you feedback on your services? Most likely a yes, because they're experts in a process or a topic. Well, your focus group is also a group of experts in their own care, which you co-produce with them. Valuing that time is often paid in coin of the realm, and you should consider, how do you demonstrate value to them for the expertise that they're delivering to your organization or institution? Incentives can be a troublesome language, one that's often rooted in the language itself. If you pay a stipend to a participant as an expert, that sounds a little bit better than just giving you a gift card to show up. You could also choose to facilitate rather than incentivize participation. When you think about that, consideration should be given to things like transportation, time from work, childcare. Food is always helpful for everyone. We often provide food at our own meetings, not because people are food insecure, but because there's a cultural value to breaking bread together. Thinking that you need to provide food to bribe people isn't the best frame. Adding food because it creates a sense of shared space and brings that cultural value to the table is a much better frame and a better way to think about the provision of this element. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think what's most important is that you really pay attention to the regulations and restrictions that come with your direct grant. We all have sort of rules and ways that we have to operate. Some may be related to your Ryan White program, other may be related to CDC funding, and some of the rules and regulations may be specific to the institution that you're in. So I think the best place to start is to have a conversation with your financial department or whoever's in charge of your fiscal aspects of your organization to say, what's possible here? And how could we make sure that what we're doing is being valued and really communicates that value to the people that we're trying to bring in?
Great advice on the fiscal piece, and I have to say I love that thought about food. It's a different way of thinking about it, because we probably all thought of if you provide it, they will come. So I like that idea that it is a sense of community, of sharing. That's wonderful. So now, if we have them interested in participating, I would think that the place that you hold this might impact their willingness to come. So do you have any tips about picking a location, and not only a location, but a date and a time? Like, do you go for an evening? Do you go for a morning? Do you go for a weekend? Do you go for a weekday? Like, chat through that for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the important thing to remember is that clinics often remind us of our care, which for some people can be a good thing, but for some people, it may just serve as a reminder of something that they really just don't want to think about. Having your focus group inside your clinic might put people into a mindset that might not lend itself to the discussion environment that you're trying to create. You want to hear from everyone. And if somebody doesn't like going to the clinic, they might choose not to come. You might want to consider a neutral location, something that's away from your normal work activities. Sometimes a different location in the institution is enough of a change. But sometimes you may consider meeting potentially at a community-based organization, but there may also be feelings about that community-based organization. So you want to be careful no matter where you land. Some communities have also developed shared space where you could consider meeting, but you want to think about the topic. If your patients feel highly stigmatized, they might not want to have this discussion outside of the clinic. You could also consider the dynamics in the community. Is there a place such as a conference center, or even consider meeting informally over a potluck dinner, which could help create a more relaxed environment? You want to think about all of the different types of people and where are they going to be most comfortable. No one place is going to be the answer for everyone. So maybe you should start by asking your patients or clients, where would be a good place for us to have this discussion? Where would you feel comfortable? Where would be accessible and easy to get to? When you think about some things, you also want to consider the time of day question there. You may end up actually considering multiple focus groups. People's work and family commitments can vary really widely. So saying that you're going to have a focus group Wednesday from 1 to 2 may work well for your staff, but they might cause a strain for people who have work commitments or younger children who may only have a half day of school. Holidays can also affect this schedule. At the end of the day, you want to make sure to pick something that works for the people you're trying to recruit, and that may or may not work easily into what works for your staff.
Okay, Adam, so now I have the people, I have the place, I have the date and the time, I have the questions. Now I need some sort of facilitator or leader. There needs to be someone in charge of that focus group. So who should that be, or who shouldn't it be, maybe I should ask? Who do I look to gather the best information I can get from my participants? And who do I find that will ask the questions in the right way?
Yeah, I think the best answer to this is really someone who can connect. And that may or may not be someone in your clinic. If you get too researchy about it, the community might actually disengage. I think it's important to remember that we're not here to study our patients. There's not going to be a randomized control trial at the end of this. You're just trying to get enough information to be useful. I would think that perhaps a community member skilled in these types of discussions. Think about your consumer liaison at the regional group level. This person may be a great choice to co-facilitate or even lead the group. In the end, you want to create a space where people feel comfortable sharing. If you have a tense relationship with your patient, entering into the room with a white coat could actually make things worse. Another idea is to consider a community leader. Is there a pastor from a church or a member of a community center that has the trust of the community you're trying to reach, who could end up brokering that conversation for you? Choosing a facilitator also needs to be someone who knows how to get what you're trying to get from the group. They need to understand how to redirect if the conversation strays while also being respectful. They need to understand the dynamics of culture and how people step up or step back due to power and privilege dynamics that could be present. Facilitators should also be able to probe when more information is needed. A co-facilitation model may actually be helpful in a focus group. Someone from the system and someone from the community, or even better, someone who is both. Helping translate responses from what people are saying and to what they are meaning can actually be tricky. While you don't want to put words into people's mouths, there may be times when the facilitator is called to be a cultural broker themselves, moving between the questions and helping to interpret the answers. Again, and I can't stress this enough, the data don't need to be so cold and unbiased. At the end of the day, you're not conducting research here. You're just trying to get the experience of your community to inform your project.
Okay, so even if I have the perfect leader or facilitator, I'm still thinking that we might be asking these folks to share some personal information. They may or may not know the other folks in the room. They may be someone they've seen in the waiting room. They may be a friend. They may be a complete stranger. So, and I'm not even sure which one of those environments is better. But how do we create that safe space so that people are comfortable giving honest answers? Now, I know that's tough. So what do you think, Adam?
So the concept of a safe space has actually really been changing over the years. And recently, I attended a training where the facilitator really changed my thinking about this. I grew up in the 80s. I remember the safe zone stickers going up in the 90s and all of the debate around how do we create a safe space? How do we sort of set these ground rules that help people feel comfortable in an environment? Well, this facilitator asked us, can we ever really create safe space? I can ask that no one shares what is said, but do I really have control over this? Someone could leave the room and share everything. And what are we really going to do about it? And the answer is nothing, really. So I think what you should strive for is respectful space. Ask the consent of the participants to engage in meaningful dialogue. And I think it's important to ask people only to share what they're comfortable with. I think it's important to set the expectation that things remain in the room while also making sure we communicate the sort of real limitations we have around making a rule like that. On the topic of sensitive issues, as we highlighted earlier, if a topic is particularly sensitive, perhaps you don't want to use a focus group for that conversation. But there could also be topics that you didn't think were very sensitive that actually might be highly sensitive. Even a topic such as, why did you fall out of care in the past, could bring conversations about experiencing intimate partner violence or self-stigmatization or shame, which could get really personal really fast. You probably want to have someone who's on standby, perhaps not in the room unless it's appropriate, but someone who could attend to anyone who may be triggered by a conversation. HIV is really tough to live with for anyone. And some of our communities still have a lot of aggressions on the micro and macro levels that could be illuminated in your conversations depending on the topic. In the end, I think it's important to be compassionate. And if you see that a conversation is going deeply personal and it's beginning to affect people in a way that concerns you, I think it's important to stop the conversation and ask if anyone would like to take a break and check in with the participants as well individually. It's important to remember that not everyone is comfortable speaking out loud about being triggered. So in the end, you want to be supportive of everyone, and that may take these smaller conversations one-on-one with people to make sure that everybody's temperature is okay and that the conversations haven't dropped in a way that could end up being harmful for people.
Okay, great advice on a tricky topic, and I'm going to push you a little further on the questions. Are there any particular techniques or tools that you use when you're trying to get at specific information that might be applicable in a focus group?
Yeah, great question. So I think there's a tendency for us, especially in the quality world, to go digging into our toolbox and pulling out our QI tools. And some of us have really big toolboxes when it comes to these. We may be very confident in using things like a fishbone diagram or the 5 whys or a driver diagram or a force field analysis, any one of the ways that we go about driving towards the answer to the problem we're trying to solve. But I think it's important to remember that most of us didn't know what a fishbone diagram was until it was taught to us. So approaching a group of community members and saying, let's make a fishbone diagram of our clinical quality issue in order to identify our root cause may actually end up being a bit of a buzzkill. So ask yourself this: do the people participating need to understand a tool that I am using, or do I need to simply structure questions that could help me populate the tool later? It's likely the latter. So when designing your focus group, if you are trying to use a QI tool, such as a driver diagram or a fishbone diagram, design your questions and your question patterns in a way to get these answers, rather than explaining a process that, frankly, we don't care about. And while I'm a big quality nerd, everyone isn't. And you may actually lose your audience if you're not careful.
Okay. Okay, some great points there, Adam. And I'm going to move on from getting the questions and the information to the answers. Talk to us a little bit about how the answers are recorded. Does someone write the conversation down? Do you use a tape recorder? Do you identify who said what? Or just talk about what that process is like.
Yeah, how do we document experience and narrative? This is always a sticking point. So some people may be perfectly fine with you recording them. Others might not be so okay, but they might agree because they feel that they must in order for their voice to be heard. It's automatically going to have some power dynamics to it, so I would recommend not recording the conversation. As to whether you need to know who said what, I can see the value in associating demographics with responses if you were doing some kind of research. But for a quality improvement project, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good here. We're looking for information to guide us, not determine our next NIH-focused grant. Having a sense of who said what may be helpful, though. For example, if you notice that all the cisgender men speak about the same issue, you may want to note that. But for the most part, you also might want to think if all the transgender women highlight a specific or particular concern, that you may want to get some more detail to ensure that you're being attentive to all the unique viewpoints of your community. But remember, we're looking for broad brush strokes here. As to having somebody write something down, I do think a note taker can be really helpful. It will allow your facilitator to focus on the job at hand, which is facilitating the conversation. Not having to stop and take notes means that the conversation can still flow. And if the note taker needs some time, the facilitator can potentially explore some more of the responses a little more to get some depth without really losing the topic. Even better might be a process where you could use something like Post-it notes or another method to have your participants sort of record their main ideas of their response to a question, and then while placing their Post-it notes on the wall, explain that response. And the note taker can be writing down information. While this may help sort of slow the flow of the responses a bit, what you can do is that after everyone has put their responses on the wall, you can come back to that back and forth dialogue, having people sort of give their reflections about what they're seeing in other people's responses and have the dialogue begin that way. Having a wall full of colorful Post-it notes can always lead to a feeling of accomplishment on the group's part, and seeing one's work visually is always really impressive.
So it seems, Adam, that our data are going to be more qualitative than the quantitative data that we're used to. So how do you analyze the conversation? And does the information get shared back later to the members, or is it enough that they were there and they heard it the first time? Or do we just share back how we're going to use the information, or do we not share back anything at all? Can you chat through that?
Sure. So I think the question is, right, how do we make meaning of all of this information? I think that's really best thought of in the planning process. You kind of want to know what you're looking for and design your focus group around that. Is a quantitative approach going to do something more useful than a qualitative approach? For example, if I have 10 people in the focus group and 5 of them respond that transportation is a barrier, will I need to know that exactly 5 people said that? Or would I need to know that about half the participants reported transportation as a barrier? You can quickly ask a group, how many people agree? And get a show of hands and estimate those responses as half, most, or all. You are likely using the information to guide a project, not make a decision that requires a vote. You want to gather the experience and views of people. This is the quality of their care, not the quantity of it. And I'm not trying to say that quantitative data never matters or doesn't have a place here. For example, if you need to prioritize a list of potential interventions or change ideas, then perhaps you could put all the ideas on a wall and then ask people to use sticker dots to vote for those ideas, whichever one they like best. This can actually give you a sense of the numbers when trying to decide in the end. But I think when you really dig down into it, the qualitative data approach is going to be most helpful. When thinking about the share back, I think it's always nice to know what you shared in a focus group was both heard and useful in some way. Think about how to capture the key points of the focus group and then potentially spread this information to all of your patients in something like a newsletter or an update flyer. You could consider posting key ideas in the clinic so everyone could see what came from the focus group. But you want to be super careful about this. If you plan to share back people's experience publicly, that you need to gain consent of the group or clearly indicate this at the beginning before people speak. You could also ask the group at the end, would key points be enough, and are you comfortable with us sharing back our findings with you and others? You may find that an email with key points is enough. Others may feel comfortable with this larger, more public version of the outcome. Whatever you decide, you just need to be really clear from the beginning with your participants about the focus group and what your intentions are with the data.
Yeah, I agree that understanding that from the onset would probably be a really good point. Now, the final outcome, of course, of a focus group would be that the information we collect would be used to drive a quality improvement project to make things better for the care of those patients. So any final thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Collecting information for collecting's sake isn't value added for anyone. Again, it might be interesting, but interesting isn't the goal here. We want to inform our projects and improve our efforts, so they're valuable both to the effort and the community. A focus group could be your root cause process. Who better to ask about the direct cause of a clinical quality issue than the people who are actually experiencing it? But you want to remember to think about this in your planning. If you've determined the reasons for your focus group, planned your interventions that are informed by a QI tool such as a fishbone, executed with a community facilitator with the aim of determining appropriate interventions, there you go. You have your key steps in the QI process. You've determined your problem, you've identified root causes, you've generated change ideas, you've prioritized those ideas, and you pressure tested them with the community, all in a co-development model, which should mean that your results, if implemented properly, are probably more meaningful and are more likely to hit your QI target.
So, Adam, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your energy, your passion, your time with us. That's all we have time for today. But Adam, if you'll stay on a little bit longer, there may be questions in the audience or from our viewers that we can address. And if anyone has a question today that doesn't get answered, you can reach Adam or myself very easily at the CQII office. So thank you so much. We're going to go back to our viewers, and grandson of quality, you're the best.
Thank you, Jane.